So we've talked about a simple protocol between clients and servers. We've talked about the idea that URIs and HTTP name the thing that you want to get. So the next logical thing to talk about is, what is it that you return to the browser? And everybody has sort of seen HTML through osmosis, I guess. Just to remind you where we are here, we're still in the second level, but now we're going to look at what happens on the client side. So far, we've been looking mostly at the server side of this picture. The goal of HTML really is to get from this, by adding this, into something like this. So really simply, HTML is a markup language. That means that, believe it or not, despite what you may have seen on other websites, it's really supposed to describe the structure of text on a web page, not the visual appearance of text. That's a different job. So the hypertext markup language actually has a fairly long and illustrious history, which we won't cover, except to tell you that it's a descendant of a markup language that IBM invented in the 60s for reading business documents, for making business documents that could be machine readable. So an HTML document is really a hierarchy of elements. That means that an element can contain other elements as its children. And some of these elements represent content that is sort of inline right on the page, like text, headings, tables, paragraphs. Sometimes the tags represent embedded content, things that are separate from the page itself but can be loaded in conjunction with it, like images or JavaScript code. And sometimes the tags represent forms, which provide a way for the user to give input and click on buttons and fill in text, which can then be supplied to the server in order to get it to do something. Elements in HTML are surrounded or delimited by tags. A tag appears in angle brackets. A closed tag has an angle bracket and a slash. Some of the tags have content. So for example, here's a paragraph or p tag whose content is the string hello world. Some have attributes. For example, here's an image tag that has an attribute source that tells the browser where the image is located. And some tags have both attributes as well as content. And because it's a hierarchy of elements, tags can usually include other tags as well. Now, of the various attributes the tags could have, two that we're going to focus on because they're particularly useful when it comes to describing the structure of a page in a way that allows you to style it easily is the ID and class attributes. And the reason we care about them in part is because we do want to control the visual appearance of our web pages and we want to make them look nice. But we want to do that in a way that respects the structure of the page. And as we'll see, there's many reasons to keep the structural and the visual concerns completely separate. Cascading style sheets, or CSS, helps us do that. So the way we use cascading style sheets is we'll put an identifying link element at the top of our page. In fact, it goes inside the head element, one of the children of head, that says this is a style sheet and this is the URI that you can download the style sheet from. So the style sheet is just a URI accessible web resource like anything else. And among the most commonly used HTML elements when we're talking about CSS are the ID and class elements because they give us a very compact way to quickly identify an element or a group of elements to which we want to apply a common set of visual styles. So in this simple example, I have a div element, which is a way of identifying different parts of the document structurally, and I'm giving it an ID of right and a class of content. The ID has to be unique within the page, so nowhere else on this page can I have any element of any kind that has the same ID right as this div element. The class can be attached to many elements, and it can even be attached to elements of different types. So it would be perfectly fine to have many other elements on this page that also share the content class. Now, how do we use these? Well, in general, we use CSS selectors as a way to identify what elements we want to apply some visual styling to. Here's a very simple example that we can use as the basis of showing how some selectors work. The simplest way we can select an element is by the tag name. So this selector says any elements that have an h1 tag, no matter what class or ID they might have, and that paints a pretty broad stroke. That's usually more general than you want. So we can also restrict it to say only elements that have a certain class. So in this case, class page frame, that would only match this div out here. Or we can match an element with a unique ID. Remember that we said the page head, in this case, the ID has to be unique on the page. Only one element can have a page head ID, and sure enough, it's the same div. Now, in this case, I've written two different selectors, both of which could match this outer div. In general, you need to be careful of not doing that in your CSS files, because then you have to worry about complicated rules regarding which set of rules gets applied when multiple rules match. And if you're using a good CSS editor program, they'll usually warn you if you accidentally do something like this. We could also use the tag name combined with the class. So this would match any div elements that have an ID of page frame. Or we could use the tag name and ID, but as you've no doubt already realized, that's usually redundant. Why? Because if an ID has to be unique on the page, then only one element can have this ID anyway, so why bother saying the element tag? The reason you would do that is really informative. It's for the designer who's looking at the CSS file wanting to make changes. This notation tells them specifically that the element whose ID is welcome is usually an image element. And that's useful because there are some styles that only make sense to apply to certain element types. The more interesting version of selectors allows you to use descendant relationships. So for example, I can say I want to match any element that has the custName class, but only if it's inside of an element that matches div. In our example, we've got a div element out here, and inside, one of its children actually does have the CSS class. So in our case, this entire span element is what will be matched by div space custName. And if we don't specify any styling for an element, then whatever its parent element gets, it inherits those attributes by default. Now, the sort of holy grail, the goal of separating markup, structural markup like HTML, from visual presentation with CSS is to really have complete separation of the two. One reason is that people with disabilities, for example, might be relying on reader software that tries to take an HTML page and read the contents to them and allow them to navigate. And if you've mixed in styling information along with your HTML structural content, it can make life more difficult for the reader programs. Now, you might be wondering how far you can actually go if you're trying to really and truly separate out the HTML markup from the CSS. And just to give you an example, here's a site called the CSS Zen Garden. And really, it's just an illustration of the power of CSS. I'm in the Safari browser here, which allows me to disable style sheets. So what would this page look like if no CSS styles were applied? Well, it would look like this. Pretty basic. But notice that the structure of the page is quite clear. We can immediately see where the headings are, major and minor headings. We can see things that are obviously intended to be lists of bulleted items. We can see the presentation order of things. Now, if we turn styles back on, the remarkable thing is that we can choose a different set of styles. Let's click on one of these at the bottom. Now, what's interesting here is that none of the HTML text has changed. In fact, if I go back and disable styles one more time, you can see that it's the same exact HTML content that we had before, but the page looks totally different. So this is sort of an extreme example. And in fact, you can click through here and look at other styles, like a robot named Jimmy. And the moral of the story is you can do a tremendous amount of visual styling just using CSS. So don't mix markup or don't mix style information into your markup.